Hey there, everyone. I hope you're settled in comfortably tonight, maybe with a warm drink nearby, or lying under your blanket, ready to drift away while listening. Before we begin, I want to ask something. Where are you listening from? What time is it for you right now? It's always fascinating to imagine people scattered across the world, some with a morning sun, others in deep night, all connected by a single quiet story. So tonight, let me take you somewhere else entirely. Back in time. To the slow heartbeat of America, when everything seemed to pause, when even the wind carried dust instead of rain. This is a story about what it was like to live in a small village during the Great Depression. Not from the view of history books or photographs, but from the eyes of one boy, a boy named Samuel Whitaker, who would later look back and remember how the world changed when money disappeared, when fields cracked open, and when silence fell heavier than thunder. I grew up in that village, a place with no real name left anymore. You wouldn't find it on a map now. The land has long since swallowed the fences, the wells, the wooden houses that creaked in the dry wind. Back then, in the early 1930s, it was a cluster of maybe 30 families, most of us farmers or shopkeepers. The roads were dirt, turning to rivers of mud after the rare rain, and dust when the wind blew, which was most days. The days began early, before sunrise, when the sky was still a faint bruise of purple and gray. My father would already be up, pulling on his boots, coughing from the dust that never seemed to settle. My mother would be in the kitchen, stirring cornmeal into hot water, trying to make it taste like something more than it was. We didn't know yet that these small, empty breakfasts were only the beginning of what was coming. The Great Depression didn't arrive all at once. It came quietly, like a slow leak in the roof that no one notices until the boards begin to rot. At first, it was just talk. Men in the village store murmuring about banks closing, about grain prices falling. Then one day, the general store stopped giving credit. Then the post office stopped delivering letters from faraway cities. Then the mill shut down, its windows dark, the wheels still. And soon after that, it was the faces. The looks people carried around with them, like they had misplaced something they couldn't name. I remember the sound of the radio in the store, the voice of the announcer saying numbers and cities I didn't understand, stocks, Wall Street, bonds. I didn't know those words, but I could feel how heavy they were. Even as a child, you could sense when something invisible had shifted, when the air itself had changed. Our village lay at the edge of wide Kansas fields, endless brown that met the horizon in a haze of gold and gray. It was beautiful, but in a lonely way. And when the rain stopped, it became something else entirely. The soil began to crumble, turning fine as ash. The wind picked it up, carrying it eastward in long brown waves. We called it dust, but it was more than that. It was like the land itself had decided to leave us behind. One afternoon, I remember standing on our porch and watching a wall of dust roll toward us from the west. It was far away at first, a faint smudge across the horizon, but it moved like something alive. Birds flew before it, vanishing into the distance. The sky darkened, the sun turned red, and the air began to taste like metal. My mother yelled for me to come inside, but I stood there for a moment longer, barefoot on the dry boards, staring at it. It was beautiful and terrifying. When it hit, it was like being inside a storm of ashes. The wind screamed, the sky disappeared, and everything, absolutely everything, was covered in brown. Afterward, we shoveled dust out of our home as if it were snow. We swept it off our beds, shook it out of our clothes, scraped it from the corners of the windows. My mother would hang wet sheets in front of the door to try and keep it out, but it always found a way in. We'd wake up coughing, our throats dry and raw, our hair and skin covered in fine grit. I was 14 that year, and I remember thinking, this must be what the end of the world looks like. Still, life went on. It always does, somehow. The church bells still rang on Sundays. The teachers still came to the one-room schoolhouse, though half the children had stopped attending because their families needed them on the farms. My best friend, Thomas, had to quit school altogether to help his father plow, even though the soil gave almost nothing back. The grown-ups spoke in low voices, late at night. Through the thin walls of our house, I could hear them, my parents, the neighbors who came by to share coffee or what little sugar they had left. They'd talk about families leaving, heading west, toward California. Some said the government was helping, others said it was just another lie. And yet, in all that uncertainty, there was something oddly steady about the rhythm of our days. We learned to live smaller, quieter, closer. We shared more because we all had less. I remember one night when my father sat outside with me, both of us watching the horizon, where the last light faded behind the clouds of dust. He said softly, "You know, Sam, folks think the worst thing a man can lose is money. But it's not. It's hope. That's the one you've got to hold on to." He said it like he was talking to himself more than to me. And even now, after so many years, I can still hear that moment in my mind. The creak of the chair, the slow wind, and my father's voice carried away by the dry air. In those days, hope was the only thing left that didn't cost anything. We passed it around like bread, a small piece for each person, just enough to keep going another day. And that's where it all began, our quiet, dusty little corner of the Great Depression. A time when the world slowed to a crawl, when people disappeared down long roads, and when even the sky seemed tired. But it was also when I first started to notice how much beauty could exist in stillness, in the flicker of a kerosene lamp, in the sound of boots on wooden floors, in the faint hum of a radio whispering from miles away. That was the year the dust came, and it never really left. The first thing to vanish from our little village wasn't the food, or even the water. It was the sound. Before the Depression, our main street had a kind of gentle music to it, the rhythmic slam of a screen door, the chatter from the barber's shop, the bell that rang each time someone entered the general store. But as the months passed, the music faded one instrument at a time, until only the wind played through the cracks in the old wooden buildings. The storekeeper, Mr. Douglas, was the first to close his doors. He had been there for as long as anyone could remember, tall, thin, with a gray mustache and a quiet way of speaking. He used to let me and my friend Thomas buy licorice sticks on credit when we didn't have a penny to our names. But one morning, I came by with an egg basket for my mother. She used to trade fresh eggs for flour, and the sign on his door read, "Closed until further notice." The windows were dark, and the bell that hung over the door no longer jingled. Later that day, I found him sitting on the step outside, hat in his hands. He didn't say much, just smiled in that tired way grown men did back then. "Nothing left to sell, Sam," he said softly. "And no one left to buy." The same story spread down the street like a quiet sickness. The tailor packed up his things and left for his brother's farm. The blacksmith started taking whatever work he could, fixing wagon wheels for food instead of money. Even the church collection plate came back empty more often than not. By winter, the main street had turned into something like a ghost of itself. The glass windows were filmed with dust. Tumbleweeds rolled lazily past the hardware store. Sometimes, if you stood there long enough, you could almost hear the echo of laughter, of voices that no longer came. It was around that time that people began to barter for nearly everything. A jar of pickled beans could buy you a few nails. A bucket of milk might get you a used pair of shoes. Money had become something strange, more like a memory than a tool. My mother's hands were always busy, knitting, mending, trading. She would sew clothes for the neighbors' children, and they'd repay her with onions, cornmeal, or sometimes just a smile and a promise for next time. And through it all, the dust kept coming. No matter how many times we swept, no matter how tightly we shut the doors, it always found its way in. It covered everything, the shelves, the dishes, even the Bible on the nightstand. It coated the inside of your lungs until you coughed blood in the mornings. We called it the brown plague, though it wasn't a sickness from germs. It was a sickness of the earth itself. I remember how, on especially dry days, the horizon would turn into a faint shimmer, as though the world itself was dissolving into the air. The cows grew thin, their ribs showing like shadows beneath their hides. Chickens stopped laying. Even the dogs howled less. It was as if all life was slowly being muffled under a heavy blanket. One evening, I went walking down the road toward the old grain elevator. I liked to go there after supper. It was the highest point near town, and from there you could see everything. The sun was low, bleeding red through the dust haze, and the field stretched out like a sea of bronze. I remember thinking it was beautiful, even though it shouldn't have been. Sometimes beauty hides in the strangest places, even in ruin. I saw Thomas there, sitting on the broken fence with his father's old hat pulled low over his face. His family's farm had been failing for months. He looked up at me and said, "Pa says we might head west come spring." "California?" I asked. He nodded. "Says they've got work there. Or so they say." I didn't know what to say back. California sounded like another planet, one where the sun was kinder, where maybe the earth still remembered how to be alive. That night, when I told my parents what Thomas said, my father didn't answer right away. He just sat there, staring into the small fire we used for light. Finally, he said, "It's a long road to chase a rumor." But I could tell, from the way he said it, that he had already begun to wonder about that road himself. As the weeks turned into months, the empty storefronts became a kind of mirror, showing us how fragile our little world had always been. What we thought was steady, the store, the mill, the farms, turned out to be as fragile as the dust itself. Yet, in that emptiness, something else started to grow, a strange kind of togetherness. Neighbors began to gather more often, not to buy or sell, but to talk. To share what little they had, to keep one another company through the long wind-choked nights. Someone would bring a fiddle, someone else a loaf of stale bread. The music was slow, often sad, but it filled the silence in a way that felt almost holy. I remember watching my mother's face in the flickering firelight during those gatherings. She looked tired, yes, but also peaceful, as if she had finally stopped waiting for better times and learned to live inside the moment she had. And maybe that was the real secret of surviving those years, not hoping for the world to return to what it was, but learning how to live inside the one that remained. By the time spring came, the village had changed beyond recognition. There were fewer people, fewer lights in the windows, fewer wagons on the road. But in the stillness, in that heavy air of loss and waiting, something was beginning to take shape, a quiet endurance that no storm could quite blow away. We didn't know it yet, but that endurance would be the only thing to carry us through what was coming next. Because the dust, as we would soon learn, was only the beginning. By the spring of 1931, the air itself seemed to carry hunger. You could taste it, a dry, bitter edge that clung to every breath. It was in the way the fields looked gray and hollow, and in the way people spoke, slow, careful, like words themselves had to be rationed. Food had become something we thought about all the time. It wasn't that we were starving, not quite yet, but every meal felt like a small negotiation with the earth. My mother could take a handful of cornmeal, a cup of water, and a pinch of salt and somehow turn it into supper. She'd call it bread, but it was really more like a pale, warm memory of what bread used to be. She'd hum softly while she cooked, an old hymn from her childhood. I never knew the words, just the rhythm, slow and steady, like the sound of rain we hadn't heard in months. That humming filled the air between us, along with the smell of dry corn toasting on the pan. One morning, I woke to find her standing at the table, staring into an empty flour sack. She didn't say a word, just folded it neatly and placed it on the shelf, like it might somehow fill itself again if she treated it kindly enough. Then she turned to me and smiled, tired but gentle. "We'll make do, Sam," she said. "We always do." The phrase "make do" became something of a prayer around then. Everyone in the village said it, when the well ran low, when the wind tore down a roof, when the crops came up dead. "We'll make do." And somehow they did. We learned to grind old corn meant for livestock into meal. We made coffee from roasted chicory roots. We boiled dandelion greens and called it stew. It wasn't good, but it was food, and that meant it was something to be grateful for. The women traded recipes the way they once traded gossip. "2 spoons of molasses if you've got it," Mrs. Douglas would say, holding up her stained apron. "None left," my mother would answer. "But maybe a drizzle of honey." The two of them would laugh, and for a moment it almost felt like the world was normal again. We also learned to save everything. Nothing was too small to keep, every piece of string, every button, every jar. Even the scraps of old dresses were turned into quilts. I remember my mother cutting tiny squares of faded fabric by lamplight, stitching them into patterns that told stories. The blue piece from my father's old shirt, the red from her wedding dress, the gray from the curtain that once hung in our kitchen. That quilt became a kind of diary, one made not from words, but from survival itself. Meanwhile, my father worked the land like it still owed him something. He'd wake before dawn, his silhouette moving through the haze, dragging the plow behind the mule. The soil had turned against him, but he refused to give up. He said the same thing every morning: "If you don't work the earth, boy, you'll forget how to pray." I didn't understand it then. Now I think he meant that work, even hopeless work, kept a man human. By midsummer, though, the fields had turned to powder. The corn stalks stood brittle and brown, their leaves curling like old paper. You could pick one up and crumble it in your hands, and it would drift away like smoke. Sometimes, when the wind blew just right, you could hear a strange whispering sound across the empty fields. It wasn't quite a voice, but close. Some folks said it was the ghosts of the land, the spirit of the soil leaving for good. Others said it was just the wind. But when you're hungry and tired, you start to believe in anything that still sounds alive. One afternoon, a man came to our door, tall, thin, wearing clothes the color of the dust itself. He held his hat in both hands and asked if we had any food to spare. My father looked at him for a long time, then nodded toward the pot on the stove. It was just boiled beans, thin as water, but the man smiled like he'd been given a feast. He ate slowly, thanked us, and said he was heading west. Said there was work in California, picking fruit, building roads, anything a man could do with his hands. When he left, my father watched him walk down the road until he disappeared into the shimmering horizon. I asked if he thought the man would make it. My father said, "A man's got to keep walking, even if the road ends before he does." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay there listening to the faint sound of the wind outside, carrying dust through the cracks. The house creaked softly, as if sighing in its sleep. I thought about that man, and about all the others like him, the ones who left their homes behind, chasing rumors of better soil, kinder skies. And then I thought about us, still here, still holding on, surrounded by dust but not yet buried in it. I wondered which was braver, to leave or to stay. The next morning, when I stepped outside, the sky was white with haze. The sun looked like a dim coin behind a curtain. Across the road, Mrs. Douglas was sweeping her porch, a hopeless task, since the dust would return by evening. But she kept sweeping anyway, her motion slow and steady, like a prayer. That image stayed with me for years, the woman and her broom, fighting back the endless wind with nothing but faith and habit. In a strange way, we all became like that, sweeping, mending, cooking, planting, as if doing the same small things over and over could somehow keep the world from unraveling completely. And perhaps it did. Because even when everything else failed, when the earth stopped giving, when the stores went dark, those small human rituals were what held us together. We didn't have much bread. We didn't have much corn. But we had each other. And that was what kept us from turning into dust ourselves. By the summer of 1932, we knew the storms were coming, though no one could have prepared for the first one. It didn't arrive quietly, nor with any polite warning. One morning, the horizon in the west began to curl like the pages of a burned book, turning golden brown, then darker, like old tea steeped too long. The wind picked up first, a low moan that rolled through the fields, rattling the loose boards on the houses and bending the few struggling trees near the edge of town. My father was already outside, checking the fences. He stood tall, gripping the post of the corral as the first gusts hit. "Get inside, Sam," he yelled, though I remember stepping closer anyway, mesmerized. The dust seemed alive. It twisted, curling like smoke, making strange shapes across the sky. It moved faster than any horse, faster than any thought. You could hear it before it arrived, a deep hissing roar that filled your ears, like the earth itself was breathing out its anger. By mid-morning, the storm hit full force. I had never seen anything like it. The sun disappeared, swallowed by the brown tide. The air turned thick and gritty, making it impossible to see more than a few feet. Every breath felt like swallowing sand. I remember my mother grabbing me and my younger sister, forcing us into the tiny cellar beneath the house. My father followed with a lantern, the flame flickering wildly against the walls as the wind shrieked above us. Inside, it was dark and silent except for our coughing and the roar of the storm outside. The walls shook, the dust finding every crack and seam, as though the storm was determined to enter every corner of our lives. I pressed my hands against my face, feeling grit between my fingers, tasting it in my mouth. And yet, in that dark, cramped space, I also felt something else, a strange awe. It was as if we were part of the earth itself, tiny figures in a vast, unstoppable world. The storm lasted for hours. We sat together, huddled, listening to the wind, to the sound of the dust pounding against the roof, to the low creak of the beams bending under its force. I thought of Thomas and his family. I wondered if they were safe in their small farmhouse, or if the storm had reached them first. The thought of the empty houses along the road made my stomach twist. Each one was a reminder that the earth could take what it wanted, and that we could only hold on for as long as it allowed. When the storm finally began to subside, the world outside had changed completely. The fields were blanketed in brown powder, fine as flour, and the crops that had survived were buried under layers of grit. Our barn doors were coated, our fences half buried. Even the trees looked different, stripped, bent, their leaves clawing at the sky. We stepped outside slowly, my father first, holding the lantern like a talisman. The air smelled of iron and dry dirt. It clung to our skin, our hair, our clothes. When we wiped our eyes, they were brown. When we coughed, the grit came up like old ash. It was terrifying. And yet, it was beautiful in a terrible, unearthly way. The sun was a dim red circle behind a veil of dust, painting the landscape in colors no painter could capture. Neighbors emerged from their homes one by one. No one spoke at first. We just looked at each other, dust covering faces and hands, the silence speaking louder than any words could. Mrs. Douglas stood in the middle of the road, her apron caked with dirt, her eyes wide. "It's the end of the world," she whispered. And yet, there was no panic, only exhaustion and a strange, quiet acceptance. We spent the following days cleaning what we could, though the dust was relentless. It seeped into every corner of our home, coating the floors, the furniture, even the food that had been left uncovered. The milk went sour faster, the bread crumbled to powder, and yet we persisted. My mother scrubbed and swept, my father repaired fences half buried in grit, and I helped where I could, feeling the slow burn of muscles I hadn't known I had. Life after the storm felt different, heavier, slower, more deliberate. We learned to keep wet cloths at every doorway, to cover jars, to sweep constantly, and to accept that no matter what we did, the dust would return. It became part of us, part of the rhythm of our lives. Children played less in the open fields, mothers went outside only when necessary, and men stayed close to the barns, trying to salvage what the storm had left. At night, I would lie awake, listening to the settling of dust outside, imagining it like waves washing over the land. I thought about the years ahead, and how many storms might come, how many crops might fail, how many people would leave in search of better soil and kinder skies. And I realized, perhaps for the first time, that survival was not just about food or shelter. It was about patience, endurance, and learning to find small moments of calm amid the chaos. Even now, decades later, I can still smell that storm, the dry metallic scent of dust, the taste of grit in the air, the oppressive silence that fell afterward. It was a turning point, a moment when the earth reminded us who truly held the power, and yet also a moment when we learned how fragile and how resilient we could be. From that day on, every gust of wind carried a memory, a whisper of the storm, of the world turned brown, of a village that refused to vanish completely. And in that memory we found something strange, the faintest glimmer of hope, like sunlight through smoke, promising that even after the dust, life could persist. By the fall of that same year, our village began seeing more strangers than usual. They didn't come in wagons or with suitcases. They came on foot, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and eyes that had seen too much. We called them the roadmen, wandering souls who traveled from town to town, from one failed farm to another, searching for work, food, or a place to rest before moving on again. I first noticed them one crisp morning when I walked down the main road to fetch water from the well. A man was leaning against the fence at the edge of town, his coat patched in mismatched colors, his boots caked with mud and dust. He had a thin face, and his eyes were sharp, scanning the horizon as if he expected something terrible to appear at any moment. He tipped his hat at me without a word, and I returned the gesture, feeling an inexplicable mix of curiosity and caution. Soon, more of them appeared, moving in small, irregular groups. Some had blankets tied across their shoulders, others carried small bundles of possessions wrapped in rags. Their feet left tracks in the dust that the wind never seemed to erase. And each one carried a story, though most were silent about it. By night, you could hear them around the edges of the village, the faint crunch of boots, the soft murmur of voices near the barn or the edge of a field. My mother would glance out the window nervously, wiping her hands on her apron, while my father simply shook his head. "Let them be," he said. "They're only passing through." Still, I was drawn to them. There was a kind of magnetism in their presence, a sense that they had seen the world beyond the dust, beyond the farms, beyond the empty storefronts that now lined our main street. I wanted to know where they came from, what they had lost, what they were searching for. One evening, I watched as a small group gathered near the old oak tree by the edge of the fields. They sat in a circle, sharing food and stories in low voices. One man, older than the rest, spoke of a factory in Chicago where he had once worked, where machines hummed and spit out products in endless rhythm. He talked about the day the factory closed and how the men were sent home with nothing, no wages, no hope, no explanation. His hands moved in the air as he spoke, carving the story out of nothing but sound. Another man spoke of California, of orchards heavy with fruit, of roads that seemed endless but full of work. He warned that it was not all gold and sun. The jobs were few, and the wages were meager. But still, the idea of leaving, of traveling to another place where perhaps the land would be kinder, was enough to make their eyes glimmer with hope. I listened from the shadows, my stomach tight with longing and fear. Could a boy like me ever see such places? Could I ever walk beyond the horizon of dust and fields that defined my entire life? My father had always said that a man needed patience, that the earth demanded respect and perseverance. But the roadmen seemed to have another philosophy, one that spoke of motion, of not waiting, of leaving behind everything familiar in pursuit of survival. They stayed only a few nights at a time, their campfires glowing faintly in the darkness, sending sparks upward like fleeting stars. In the mornings they vanished, leaving only footprints and memories of their voices in the wind. Sometimes, I would follow their tracks down the road for a while, imagining what awaited them, trying to see beyond the horizon into the unknown. The village learned to live with them. Some families offered small meals or a place to rest, trading kindness for stories of the wider world. Some were wary, fearing theft or trouble, though in truth, the roadmen took little but the space to exist and the chance to be seen. Their presence reminded us that our village was part of a larger struggling nation, a network of lives touched by loss, dust, and endless movement. It was both comforting and unsettling. One night, after most had left, my father and I walked past the barn where a few still lingered. A man no older than I was sat hunched against the fence, his eyes bright under the dim moonlight. "You going to leave too?" he asked softly. I shook my head. "I don't know. I've never been anywhere else." He smiled, faint and tired. "You will someday. Just remember, the road isn't kind, but it teaches you things the earth never could." That night, I lay awake thinking about the roadmen, about their courage, their desperation, and the strange freedom that traveled with them. I wondered if I would ever find myself walking beside them, or if I would remain rooted in the dust that seemed determined to claim our village. And as I drifted to sleep, the wind outside carried their voices faintly, laughter, arguments, warnings, songs. It was the sound of the world beyond the horizon calling to me, whispering that life could exist in more than one shape, more than one place. The roadmen were only passing through, yet they left an imprint on all of us who watched them, a reminder that survival wasn't just about enduring the storm, the dust, or the hunger. Sometimes, survival meant daring to move, daring to leave, daring to seek what lay beyond the next hill, the next state, the next life. And even as they disappeared down the endless dusty road, I knew their stories would stay with me forever, like the dust itself, settling in every corner of my memory. It was late autumn when my father and I decided to walk beyond the last edge of our village, past the fields we still tried to coax into life. The wind was sharp, carrying the first hints of winter, and the sun hung low, brushing the horizon with a pale, tired light. We were heading toward what remained of the McAllister farm, a place I had passed countless times on the road, but never ventured into. The house had been empty for months. The crops had failed, the fences had rotted, and the air around it smelled faintly of earth left untended, of wood slowly giving back to the soil. When we arrived, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the quiet of a normal day, but a silence that seemed to settle like dust in the corners of the mind. Heavy, unbroken, almost sacred. The gate hung on one hinge, swinging slightly with the wind. The barn doors were half off their hinges, exposing nothing but shadows inside. The windows, some cracked, some missing entirely, reflected the gray sky like blind eyes staring into nothing. My father stopped at the edge of the yard. He didn't speak for a long while, just stared at the house, the barn, the skeletal trees that once bore fruit. I could see in his eyes a mix of grief and understanding. "This is what happens," he said finally. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, though it carried weight. "When the earth turns against you, and there's nothing left to give, you leave. You pack what you can, and you hope somewhere else the soil will be kinder." I wandered through the yard, crunching over dead leaves and brittle stalks of corn. Everything was coated with a fine layer of dust, and the wind stirred it up with each step, sending ghostly clouds into the air. Inside the farmhouse, the kitchen smelled faintly of old smoke and forgotten meals. The table was still set with chipped plates and cracked cups. I ran my fingers over them, imagining the last family dinner, the children laughing, the mother calling them to eat, the father's heavy sigh after a long day. And then I remembered something my father had said once: "Even when you leave, the place keeps a memory of you. The land doesn't forget the hands that worked it, the hearts that loved it." Upstairs, the bedrooms were eerily still. Beds sagged under the weight of time, sheets yellowed and brittle. On a dresser lay an old photograph, dusty and curled at the edges, a family portrait, smiling faces staring out as though frozen in hope that could not last. I picked it up carefully. There was a mother with a warm, tired smile, a father standing tall behind her, and 3 children clutching each other. I traced their faces with my finger, feeling the weight of their absence. The photograph was all that remained of their life here, all that testified to a world that had vanished. Outside, my father called me back. He was standing near the barn, looking at a plow half buried in the earth, rust eating away at its metal like time itself. "They went west," he said. "California, maybe. Heard work in the orchards. Some of them made it, some of them didn't. But they had to try." I nodded, understanding both the courage and the despair in leaving. To walk away from the life you know, to give up the home you've grown up in, to abandon fields you've worked with your own hands, it takes more than desperation. It takes a kind of quiet bravery that not everyone can summon. We stayed a while longer, wandering the yard, examining the barns, listening to the wind whisper through broken windows. The sound was hollow, like a voice from another time, and for the first time, I felt the weight of what it meant to survive in a place that seemed to be quietly disappearing. Even the trees, stripped of fruit and leaves, seemed to bow in resignation to the storm of years and dust that had passed over them. Before we left, my father picked up a small, broken bucket. He held it for a moment, then set it down carefully, as if acknowledging the life that had been contained in this farm. The meals, the water, the sweat, the laughter, the tears. "I guess the land keeps what it wants," he said softly. "And we take what we can carry." As we walked back to our own house, I looked over my shoulder one last time. The McAllister farm stood empty and silent, but it had left a mark on me. It was a reminder that life could vanish in months, that families could be uprooted, that the land could turn its back without warning. And yet, even in its absence, there was something hauntingly beautiful, a testimony to the lives that had been lived there, the love that had been given, and the courage that had taken them to walk into the unknown. That evening, the village seemed quieter than usual. The emptiness of the McAllister farm hung over us like a shadow, but it also reminded us that we still had time, still had home, still had each other, for now. And in the silence, the wind carried a whisper of distant roads, of families marching west, of survival, of hope, of a world that was waiting for us somewhere beyond the dust. That winter, our little household received something extraordinary, a radio. It wasn't large or fancy. It was a wooden box with a glass front, a few knobs that clicked and hummed when you turned them. But to us, it was more than a box. It was a window to the world beyond the dust, beyond the empty streets and barren fields. My father brought it home one evening, wrapped in a burlap sack. He placed it on the kitchen table, where the lamplight flickered against the polished wood. My mother wiped her hands on her apron and looked at it with a mixture of awe and skepticism. "What's it do?" my sister asked. Her eyes were wide, filled with that curious wonder children always have. "It speaks," my father said simply, smiling. "It carries voices from far away." We gathered around, uncertain, as he plugged it in. The hum of electricity buzzed through the room, and then slowly, a voice came through, faint, crackling, but unmistakably human. It was a man speaking about cities we'd never seen, about farmers, workers, and news from distant towns. And then music followed, soft melodies, jazz tunes, songs that made the heart ache and soar all at once. It was more than entertainment. It was hope. Every evening, we would sit close to the radio, listening to the voices that seemed impossibly far away. President Roosevelt spoke to the nation, promising recovery, promising work, promising something better. My parents didn't always believe it, but they listened anyway, clinging to the possibility that the world could change, that the earth might finally give us something other than dust. I remember one night vividly. The wind was strong outside, rattling the windows, carrying grit across the porch. We had very little to eat, a thin soup of beans and corn, but we huddled around that radio like it contained fire, warmth, and the future itself. The announcer spoke of a small town in New York where factories were starting to hire again, where families could hope for a little comfort. The words seemed distant, almost dreamlike, but for a moment, it felt as if the despair we'd lived under could be lifted. It wasn't just the news. It was the stories of other people, letters read aloud, voices of women and men describing their daily struggles, their small victories, their fleeting joys. We could imagine them, families sitting around their own radios, children laughing, bread rising in ovens, farms thriving under kinder skies. My mother started keeping a small notebook, writing down the recipes she heard about from distant kitchens, the names of towns where the rain still fell, the crops still grew. It became a diary of dreams we could almost touch, a map of hope etched in pencil on paper. Even my father, who rarely smiled, would nod at certain broadcasts. "They're telling the truth somewhere," he said once. "Maybe not here, not yet. But somewhere." It was the first time I saw a glimmer of something I hadn't dared name before, hope, in his eyes, a spark that the dust and the storms hadn't managed to extinguish. The radio also brought music, and with it, laughter that felt foreign yet comforting. Children's songs, the croon of distant singers, the soft hum of instruments that seemed to carry warmth through the cold winter nights. I would lie on the floor, staring at the ceiling, imagining those faraway places, streets bustling with people, snow falling softly in one town, sunlight spilling across orchards in another. It became a ritual. Every evening, after we had eaten what little we could muster, we would gather near the radio. Sometimes neighbors came by, carrying a small jar of preserves or a loaf of bread, sharing it while listening together. The room would fill with stories, melodies, and the quiet murmur of conversations about dreams and possibilities. And somehow, even in the harshest winter, with the wind whipping dust across the frozen fields, the radio reminded us that life existed beyond the horizon. It was a tether to a world that hadn't forgotten us, that offered the possibility of survival, of escape, of hope. I realized then that hope could be small and fragile, almost invisible, yet still powerful enough to keep people moving forward. It didn't fill empty bellies or restore ruined crops, but it filled hearts, and hearts were what kept hands going, minds thinking, and families together. That winter, with the radio crackling in the corner and my parents close beside me, I began to understand something vital. Survival was not only about what we could see, touch, or hold in our hands. It was also about listening to voices that promised something beyond the dust, beyond the storms, beyond the fear. And as the night stretched on, long and cold, I held onto those voices like fire, letting them warm the corners of my soul that the depression had tried to freeze. Hope, I learned, could come in the smallest forms, in the hum of a radio, in the crackle of electricity, in the faint smile of someone who refuses to give up. And for the first time, I felt that maybe, just maybe, the world still had room for us. Winter arrived in earnest that year, wrapping the village in a thick, gray silence. The dust of the previous months had mixed with frost, creating a fine layer of gritty ice that coated every fence post, every roof, every bare branch. The fields lay empty, frozen in a brittle slumber, and the wind cut through the village like a knife, carrying with it a taste of metal and snow. Despite the cold, the schoolhouse remained open. It was a one-room building, its wooden walls groaning under the weight of years, with windows so drafty that even the heaviest coats could barely keep out the chill. I had always enjoyed school in the warmer months. The small lessons, the stories the teacher told, the faint smell of chalk dust mixing with the scent of the woods beyond the fields. But winter made it something else entirely, a test of endurance, patience, and quiet resilience. The children huddled together, sitting on benches worn smooth by generations, sharing scarves, mittens, even old coats that were passed down from siblings or neighbors. The teacher, Miss Harper, did her best to keep the fire going in the stove, feeding it scraps of which she collected from neighbors' yards. The room would fill with smoke at times, curling up toward the ceiling, mixing with our breath, our coughs, and the faint smell of wet boots and frostbitten clothes. We learned arithmetic by candlelight, adding and subtracting numbers that seemed abstract against the tangible hunger we carried in our bellies. Reading lessons were more than letters and words. They were windows into lives we longed for, tales of faraway cities, of people who could dream without the constant pull of despair. Even spelling felt like a rebellion against the monotony of the dust-laden streets. Outside, the wind howled relentlessly. Sometimes it sounded like a chorus of lost voices, carrying the sorrow of empty farms and abandoned roads. I could imagine the roadmen trudging westward, snow settling on their shoulders, their hands stiff with cold, their eyes fixed on a horizon that promised both hope and danger. Inside the schoolhouse, we were insulated from most of that reality, but not from its echo. Food at school was meager, sometimes a piece of bread, occasionally a small cup of milk or a spoonful of thin soup. The children who had the least often went without, their stomachs rumbling in time with the scratching of chalk across the board. I remember sharing my lunch with Thomas once, a small slice of bread with a smear of molasses, because his family's farm had yielded nothing that week. There was no shame in giving or receiving. Survival depended on community, on the unspoken understanding that none of us could thrive alone. Yet, amidst the cold and scarcity, there were moments of warmth. Miss Harper would tell stories of snow-covered mountains, of cities where the streets glimmered with lights, of children who danced and played without worry. Her voice was steady, like a flame against the winter's chill, and for a few precious minutes, we could imagine another world entirely. Sometimes, I would glance out the windows at the skeletal trees and the frozen fields, imagining what it would be like to live somewhere untouched by dust and drought, somewhere where the soil still remembered how to give life. And then I would look back at the faces around me, neighbors, friends, classmates, and realized that even here in the heart of struggle, there was something sustaining us, our quiet determination to continue, to learn, to endure. The stove sputtered, sending waves of warmth that never fully reached the far corners of the room. I would huddle close to it, fingers stretched toward the meager heat, feeling the contrast between the harsh world outside and the fragile cocoon we had created inside. Every lesson, every shared laugh, every whispered story of hope was a small act of resistance against the relentless weight of the Great Depression. By the time school let out, the village was often cloaked in gray, the roads slick with ice and mud, the wind unyielding. Yet we carried with us the faint glimmer of resilience learned in that one-room schoolhouse, a reminder that survival was not only about shelter or food, but about spirit, about connection, about holding on to fragments of light in the midst of shadow. That winter taught me that education, even in its smallest, coldest, and most meager form, was a lifeline. It kept minds sharp, imaginations alive, and hearts tethered to the possibility that life could continue beyond the immediate hardships. It was a fragile but powerful proof that even in the darkest winters, some seeds of hope could take root. And as I trudged home each afternoon, boots crunching over frost-bitten earth, scarf pulled tight around my face, I carried with me more than lessons from books. I carried the quiet, stubborn strength of our village, of our schoolhouse, and of the children who refused to let the dust and cold define the limits of their dreams. As December settled in, the village felt smaller than usual, as though the cold had squeezed the life out of every street, every yard, every worn fence post. The wind sliced through the air with relentless precision, and the fields were nothing more than brittle skeletons of what had once been crops. Yet, even in the harshest months, our village found a way to gather, to resist the loneliness, and to preserve the fragile threads that held us together. It was the tradition of the winter feast, though feast was a relative term these days. There were no elaborate meals, no tables groaning with abundance. Instead, families brought what little they could spare, a handful of beans, a thin loaf of bread, a few dried apples or turnips, scraps of preserved meat, or a jar of honey. The important thing was not the quantity of food, but the act of sharing, the warmth of company, and the stories that traveled with each dish. That year, the Douglas family offered the largest contribution. Mrs. Douglas had managed to save a small sack of flour and a jar of molasses, which she used to bake a dozen brittle, dark cookies. The scent of them filled the room, and for a moment, it felt like sunlight had been trapped in the kitchen, sweet and fleeting. My mother brought a pot of stew, thin and watery, but seasoned with a few dried herbs that she had managed to salvage from the garden before frost. The McAllister children, now passing through, heading west with their parents, contributed a few roots and a small piece of salted pork they had managed to carry across the dust-blown fields. We gathered in the old barn, where the broken roof had been partially patched and a small fire in the corner cast flickering shadows against the hay-strewn walls. The air smelled of wood smoke, dried earth, and food, a mixture that seemed almost sacred. Families huddled together, sharing blankets, whispering to keep the fire alive in their hearts as well as in the corner of the room. Spoons clinked against bowls. Bread was passed from hand to hand, each piece soaked in stew or buttered with what little fat remained. There were no empty chairs. Every adult, child, and wandering roadman had found a place. And as we ate, the stories began to travel from mouth to ear, slowly stitching the fabric of community back together, even if only for a few hours. Old Mr. Douglas began with tales from before the Depression, stories of harvests too plentiful, of wagons overflowing with produce, of festivals and fairs that seemed like dreams now. His voice was calm, almost hypnotic, carrying us to a world we had all forgotten existed. Then came the younger men, who spoke of journeys along the roads west, of towns that had grown silent, of work that could be found and lost in the same day. Their stories were filled with caution, warning, and yet a faint, stubborn glimmer of hope that one could survive beyond the dust. The children told their own stories, imaginative flights that offered laughter in the dim light. They acted out adventures, playing at cowboys or explorers in lands untouched by hardship. Their joy was infectious, cutting through the lingering weight of winter like sunlight through clouds. As the night deepened, music began to rise. One of the roadmen had a small fiddle, scratched and weathered, its bow moving across the strings with care. A melody, simple but haunting, filled the barn. Others joined with soft harmonies, voices trembling with cold yet warm with shared experience. We clapped our hands in time, tapping feet into the hay, creating rhythm that matched the pulse of life itself. Through the stories and songs, through the passing of plates and bread, something profound took shape. It was more than survival, it was resilience. It was understanding that even when the land betrayed us, when storms buried crops and dust choked the air, we could find sustenance in each other. The meal was modest, the heat meager, the light flickering, but together, it became something extraordinary. I remember looking around at my family, at the neighbors, at the faces of travelers who had nowhere else to go. Their expressions held exhaustion, hunger, and worry, but also determination, a quiet bravery that no dust storm, no failing farm, no empty cupboard could erase. By the time the last plate was cleared and the fire had burned low, we all felt a little lighter, a little warmer, a little more certain that we could endure the winter yet another day. The barn doors closed behind us as we stepped into the night, and the cold bit at our cheeks, but the weight of loneliness was softened, as if our shared warmth had created a small bubble of light that would carry us through the frost. That night, as I lay beneath my blankets, the faint scent of smoke and stew lingering on my clothes, I realized something crucial. The depression could take crops, jobs, and money, but it could not steal the human need to gather, to share, to tell stories, and to hope together. Even in the dustiest, coldest, harshest winter, we were alive, not merely existing, but truly living through our connections, our voices, and our unspoken promise to each other that we would endure. It was early spring when the letter arrived. I remember the sound of the postman's boots crunching through the frost-hardened dirt outside our gate, the clatter of the mail pouch against his hip, the faint call of a neighbor asking if he had any news. My mother took the envelope with trembling hands, a thin, creased paper, edges slightly frayed, the handwriting hurried yet careful. The letter was from my Aunt Clara, who had moved to the city a year earlier, chasing the promise of work that our village could never offer. She wrote of streets crowded with people, of factories that roared like beasts, of children who played in alleyways rather than fields. Her words painted a world that was dizzying and strange, full of life yet heavy with struggle. "We are managing," she wrote. "The apartments are small, the work is long, and the wages are never enough, but we are alive. We keep our heads down, and we hope for the brighter days we were promised. Sometimes I see the men from the road passing through the city, carrying the same dust and sorrow that I know all too well, and yet somehow we endure." My father read the letter aloud, his deep voice breaking slightly in places, carrying every word across the kitchen. I could see his fingers tighten around the paper as if holding on to her experiences, her triumphs, and her hardships all at once. My mother nodded silently, absorbing each sentence like a precious gift, while my sister leaned forward, eyes wide, imagining the strange, bustling city described in such vivid detail. What struck me most was not the description of the streets, nor the factory work, nor even the noise that seemed impossible to imagine, but the way my aunt spoke of community amidst chaos. She described neighbors who shared what little they had, children who learned to find joy in small victories, and families who wrote letters like lifelines, connecting hearts across impossible distances. It was a reminder that survival wasn't limited to our village, to the dirt roads and dust storms. Survival was everywhere, in every home, every street, every heartbeat. People fought in different ways, some with the soil, some with machines, some with voices on the radio, and some simply by writing letters like this one. After reading it, my father folded the paper carefully, placing it next to the radio. "Even there," he said, his voice low, "they find ways to keep going. It's not easy anywhere, Sam. But life finds a way, even in the cracks, even in the dust." I thought about the roadmen, moving westward, the McAllisters, abandoned farm behind them, and now my aunt, surviving in the city. There was a strange thread connecting all of us, a line of endurance, a willingness to carry on no matter where the land, the roads, or the buildings tried to push us down. That evening, I lay awake imagining the city streets, the factory's relentless hum, and the people navigating their own hardships with courage and creativity. I pictured my aunt walking to work, carrying her hope as carefully as we carried firewood through the winter storms, determined to survive, to endure, to thrive where she could. The letter became more than just words on paper. It became a symbol of possibility, a glimpse of a world beyond our fields and dust. It reminded us that life could be larger than our immediate hardships, that endurance and courage were universal, and that even when the earth seemed barren, even when storms blew relentlessly, the human spirit could stretch across distances, binding us together in invisible ways. And for the first time I began to wonder, when our own land failed, when the dust storms returned, when the winter nights stretched endlessly, perhaps the solution wasn't just to stay, to endure, to cling. Perhaps the answer was also to move, to seek, to chase the elusive promise that lay just beyond the horizon. The letter was folded neatly, placed beside the radio, and I could feel it humming quietly in the room, a reminder that life existed beyond our small village, beyond the dust, beyond our fears. And for the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future that wasn't just survival, but discovery, movement, and the faintest glimmer of hope that our story, like my aunt's, could continue in ways we had never yet dreamed. Spring arrived slowly that year, hesitating as if unsure it was allowed to return. The wind still carried grit, and the fields were coated with a layer of dry, stubborn dust that had survived the winter frost. Yet beneath it all, life stirred quietly, insistently, determined to reclaim what had been stolen by storms and neglect. The first signs were subtle, a green shoot pushing through cracked soil, a small cluster of crocuses curling toward the pale sun, a trickle of water running through a furrow that had seemed dead. My father noticed it first, stooping low in the field to examine the stubborn shoots of wheat that had survived the frost. His hands, rough and cracked, cupped the fragile stems, and I could see a faint smile break across his dirt-stained face. "Life fights," he said simply. "Even when we've given up, it fights." My mother began planting again, though cautiously. She had learned the hard way not to trust the soil blindly, but there was a rhythm in her planting, a ritual of hope interwoven with pragmatism. Corn, beans, and squash were sown carefully, rows measured and marked, seeds pressed gently into the earth as if coaxing it to remember its purpose. I helped where I could, carrying water from the well, pulling weeds that threatened the tender shoots, listening to my father's quiet instructions. Each day, I felt the soil beneath my fingernails, gritty yet alive, and I realized that survival wasn't just about enduring hardship, but about nurturing possibility. Every seed pressed into the ground was a promise, to the land, to ourselves, to the future. The village slowly came alive again. The air smelled of damp earth and wildflowers that had returned despite the dust. Children laughed more freely, chasing one another through the thawing streets, leaving trails of mud that would soon dry into stubborn patterns on boots and trousers. The roadmen had moved on, seeking work further west, but the memory of their presence lingered, a reminder that the world beyond the village existed and that we too might someday venture beyond the horizon. One afternoon, as I worked near the edge of the fields, I saw a family walking past the McAllister farm, now slowly being reclaimed by grass and new shoots. They were small, bundled against the cool air, carrying tools and supplies. They paused at the edge of the field, surveying the land with careful eyes, as if weighing whether life could once again take root there. In their quiet determination, I recognized a mirror of our own, the courage to try, even when the odds seemed stacked against us. The river that ran along the northern edge of the village had begun to thaw, its icy crust giving way to flowing water that carried both silt and promise. Fishermen came with nets, children dipped their hands into the cold current, and the sound of flowing water was a reminder that even the most stagnant, dust-choked world could renew itself. Evenings were filled with the hum of anticipation. Families gathered by the stove, discussing planting strategies, sharing seeds and tips, and talking quietly about the possibilities of the new season. The radio continued to hum in the corner, broadcasting news of distant towns, reports of rain in regions long parched, and stories of neighbors far away reclaiming their lives after months of struggle. Each broadcast, each conversation, each shared moment became a thread in the tapestry of resilience that held the village together. One day, I wandered into the barn, watching the sunlight filter through the cracks in the wood, dust particles suspended like tiny stars. I thought of the storms we had endured, the roadmen we had watched pass, the abandoned farms, the letters from cities, and the winter feast that had reminded us of our strength. And yet, all of it seemed to converge in that moment, a profound awareness that life, even fragile and tentative, would persist. By late afternoon, the fields had taken on a muted glow, green and brown intertwined in tentative harmony. The air was warmer, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and the first blooms of wildflowers. I stood there, breathing it in, feeling the pulse of life beneath my boots, and understood that the cycle of survival was ongoing, relentless, and beautiful in its quiet insistence. Spring in the dust was not the triumph of abundance. It was the subtle, stubborn return of possibility. It was the reminder that even after storms, droughts, and despair, life pushes forward. It was proof that we too could push forward, one day at a time, one small act of care, one seed planted, one story shared at a time. And as I walked home through the warming fields, I knew that the dust would return in some form, storms would come again, and hardship would test us anew. Yet for now, there was growth, movement, and the quiet miracle of life asserting itself once more. By late summer, the fields had begun to reward our careful work. The small shoots of corn, beans, and squash that my mother and I had planted back in early spring now stood tall and resilient, swaying gently in the warm breeze. The dust still lingered in corners, and storms were never far from memory, but for the first time in months, the land seemed willing to give something back. The harvest was modest, but to us, it was a miracle. My father led the work, his hand steady and sure despite the roughness of the soil and the years of hardship etched into his skin. I followed closely, carrying baskets, pulling the ripe vegetables from the earth, feeling the soil crumble between my fingers. My mother's voice rang out over the fields, directing, encouraging, occasionally scolding me for bending the stalks too roughly. Even my younger sister joined, learning which beans were ready, which squash had matured enough to pick. Neighbors came to help, some staying a short while, others lingering through the day, offering advice, lending hands, sharing the joy of success. There was laughter in the air, a rare and fragile kind, as children ran between the rows, chasing one another, picking the occasional strawberry that had stubbornly survived the frost. The harvest brought a sense of triumph tempered with humility, a quiet understanding that the land could give, but it could also take back in an instant. The baskets grew heavy, filled with corn, beans, squash, and a few small, bright tomatoes that seemed almost too vivid against the muted browns of the fields. The smell of earth and vegetation mingled with the scent of sweat, forming a pungent reminder of labor and reward intertwined. My father paused occasionally, wiping his brow with the back of his hand, looking out across the field as though measuring the yield against the trials of the past months. When the work was done, we brought the harvest to the barn, spreading it out across tables, floors, and empty crates. The sight of it filled the space with color and life, a tangible manifestation of hope and perseverance. Families gathered to inspect, discuss, and divvy up the bounty. It was not enough to sell at market, not enough to fill every empty cupboard, but enough to sustain us, enough to remind us that effort, care, and patience were rewarded, even if only in small measures. That evening, we celebrated quietly. My mother cooked a simple stew with fresh vegetables, thickened with a bit of flour and seasoned with dried herbs. The family sat together around the table, eating slowly, savoring each bite, sharing stories of planting, storms, and survival. The radio, our ever-present companion, hummed in the corner, broadcasting news of other farms finding similar small successes, of markets beginning to stir, of distant towns cautiously hoping for recovery. As night fell, the cool breeze carrying the scent of ripening fields through the open windows, I walked outside and looked up at the sky. The stars seemed brighter, sharper against the dark velvet of night, as if acknowledging the quiet triumphs of the earth below. I thought of the McAllister farm, the roadmen, my aunt in the city, and all the families who had endured similar struggles. Somewhere out there, they too were reaping the small rewards of hard work, finding relief in moments of abundance, and daring to hope again. The first harvest was more than food, it was a reaffirmation of life itself. It reminded us that even when the world seemed barren, even when the dust returned and storms threatened, resilience, and determination could yield results. It taught us that survival was not passive, it was active, demanding attention, effort, and care. That night, as I lay in bed, exhausted yet exhilarated, I understood something vital. Each season brought its trials, but also its rewards. Each storm, each winter, each hardship was a part of the cycle, a test not just of our bodies but of our spirit. And the first harvest was proof that we could endure, that we could coax life from the dust, and that no matter how harsh the world became, persistence, patience, and hope could still produce beauty and sustenance. I drifted to sleep thinking of the days ahead, of planting again, of tending the fields, of stories yet to be told, of the life that stretched before us like the long winding horizon, dust and all. A few weeks after the first harvest, the village decided to hold a barn dance. It was a tradition older than most of the families could remember, a way to celebrate survival, community, and the small victories the earth had begrudgingly offered. That year, the dance felt more important than ever, a reprieve from the dust, the storms, and the persistent weight of the depression. The barn was scrubbed and patched as best we could. Windows were cleaned, or at least the grime was wiped in streaks that let the sun shine through enough to cast patterns on the hay-strewn floor. Ropes of dried herbs and flowers hung along the beams, a faintly fragrant attempt to make the space festive. Families worked together, carrying hay bales for seating, sweeping out dust, and ensuring that the small makeshift stage in the corner could hold the musicians. Evening arrived with a sky painted in muted purples and oranges, the sun dropping behind distant hills as the villagers gathered. Children ran ahead, laughing and shouting, their voices carrying on the wind like birds escaping captivity. Adults followed more slowly, arms linked, offering greetings and small gifts. A loaf of bread, a jar of preserves, a piece of cloth, anything that could be shared in celebration. Music began as the fiddler from the roadmen returned, a familiar face now, whose strings sang despite the wear of travel and hardship. Soon, harmonicas, a battered accordion, and a few improvised percussion instruments joined in. The melodies were simple, sometimes shaky, but filled with energy, vitality, and a rhythm that seemed to beat directly against the fatigue we had carried for months. The first dances were hesitant. Couples stepped cautiously, skirts brushing hay, boots clomping against the wooden floor. Children spun in circles, arms outstretched, faces flushed with excitement. Laughter filled the barn, sometimes spilling out into the yard, mixing with the wind, carrying faint echoes of joy across the village. I watched my father dance for the first time in years, his movements stiff at first, then gradually loosening, finding rhythm in a world that had demanded rigidity and endurance for so long. My mother, smiling softly, swayed beside him, a silent acknowledgement that even in hardship, moments of beauty and connection could exist. My sister darted between dancers, her laughter ringing like bells, while I found myself caught up in the energy, tapping my boots and clapping along to the beat. Stories began to circulate between dances. Elders recounted times before the Depression, tales of festivals that drew people from miles away, of harvests so plentiful the barns could barely hold the grain. The younger men and women shared news of relatives in distant towns, of work and wages, of small victories that proved resilience was not just a dream but a tangible, living thing. Even the roadmen, now familiar faces in the village, joined the dances and stories. One of them spoke quietly of a journey westward that had failed halfway, of nights spent in barns and abandoned houses, of kindness and cruelty encountered along the way. The tales were tinged with sadness but also with humor, and each listener felt the complex mixture of life's hardships and the moments of grace that made it bearable. By the late hours, the barn felt almost magical. Dust hung in the air, illuminated by lanterns that swung gently from the beams, casting shadows that danced along with us. Music and laughter blended with the scent of hay, sweat, and faint traces of cooking fires. It was a rare instance where the weight of the world lifted, however briefly, allowing the villagers to breathe, to connect, and to celebrate the very act of being alive. As I stepped outside for a moment, the cool night air was sharp against my flushed cheeks. I looked up at the stars, brighter than I had seen them in months, and imagined the world beyond our village. Cities humming with life, roads stretching endlessly, farms slowly recovering. The barn dance, I realized, was more than a celebration, it was a declaration. We endured, we thrived, we held on to hope and community, even when everything around us suggested otherwise. When I returned inside, the final song played, slow and tender. Couples swayed in place, children leaning against parents, laughter softening into murmurs. For a fleeting moment, the barn was timeless, a sanctuary where dust, despair, and fear had no power. And as the lanterns dimmed and families began to leave, the energy lingered in the air, a quiet testament to the resilience, joy, and determination that bound us together. That night, I went to bed with sore feet, a full belly, and a mind buzzing with music, laughter, and stories. The barn dance had reminded me, more than any harvest or letter or radio broadcast could, that survival was not just about enduring alone. It was about connection, about celebration, about holding on to the sparks of life even when the world seemed determined to snuff them out. Just as the village began to settle into the rhythms of spring and early summer, the dust returned. Not gradually, but in sudden sweeping waves that seemed to erase the world we had so painstakingly coaxed back to life. The sky turned a sickly brown, the sun reduced to a faint, blurred disk, and the wind carried particles sharp enough to cut the skin if one wasn't careful. It started in the late afternoon. I remember seeing the first hints of it from the edge of the fields, a low rolling cloud moving with purpose, swallowing fences, roads, and distant hills. Birds scattered, crows cawing in panic, and even the river seemed to retreat, choked with sediment. My father's face darkened as he watched the horizon, recognizing the familiar signs of what we feared most, a storm that could undo months of toil in hours. The village sprang into action. Windows were boarded where possible, barns secured, and livestock moved to sheltered areas. My mother corralled my sister and me, dragging blankets and food into the small cellar beneath our home. It was cramped and suffocating, filled with the smells of damp earth and stored vegetables, but it was safe. Once the wind began in earnest, it felt alive, angry, relentless, indifferent. Dust scoured the roof, rattled the walls, and found its way through every crack, coating skin, hair, and clothes. It clawed at the lungs, filled eyes, and made even simple breaths feel like labor. The storm carried with it a haunting sound, a low, constant roar, like the distant cry of 1,000 lost voices. From the cellar, we could hear neighbors calling to each other, voices muffled, strained by the wind and distance. Every now and then, a window rattled or a piece of siding tore free, clattering against the walls. The world outside became almost unrecognizable, a swirling, shifting brown haze where familiar landmarks disappeared, and even the fields we had so carefully tended vanished beneath layers of grit. My father stayed calm, though the worry was clear in his eyes. He checked the livestock, reassured neighbors, and reminded us to breathe slowly and stay low in the cellar. His hands were steady, though dirt and sweat mixed with fine dust to form a grime that coated everything he touched. My mother moved silently among us, distributing water and bits of bread, whispering encouragement to keep our spirits intact. Hours passed like days. The storm had no mercy, and we learned once again how small we were in comparison to the land, to the wind, to the forces that shaped our lives. Even the radio struggled to reach us, crackling intermittently with faint voices from distant towns, news of storms elsewhere, and the faint reassurance that life continued beyond the dust. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the haze, the village emerged cautiously. Streets were buried under a layer of fine, pervasive dust, fences leaned precariously, and barns had lost shingles or boards. The crops we had nurtured, the first tentative harvest of the year, were smothered in grit, some entirely destroyed, others stubbornly standing beneath the layer of brown suffocation. Despite the devastation, there was no despair. The villagers moved immediately to assess damage, repair what could be repaired, and salvage what could be saved. Hands that had been steady in planting, harvesting, and dancing now worked to clear paths, brush dust from rooftops, and nurse the earth back to life. We had endured storms before, and though each one threatened to break us, each one also reminded us that survival demanded effort, courage, and resilience. I spent the morning helping my father dig through dust-covered soil, uncovering vegetables and shoots that had survived the storm's fury. My hands were raw, my arms scraped, but with each discovery, a small surge of hope returned. The storm had not taken everything. Life, stubborn as ever, remained. By evening, the village gathered again, not for celebration, but for a quiet reckoning, sharing news of losses, offering help, and planning for the work ahead. The storm had reminded us of our fragility, but also of our strength, the unbroken ties that bound us to each other and to the land. That night, lying beneath blankets dusted with fine grit, I realized that the depression had taught us not just endurance, but flexibility. We had learned to hope without certainty, to act without guarantee, and to continue even when the world seemed intent on burying us beneath its own weight. The dust storm had returned, but so had our resolve. And as I drifted into uneasy sleep, I understood something fundamental. Survival was not the absence of storms, but the courage to face them together again and again. It was early morning when we first saw him. A figure trudging along the cracked, dust-choked road, hunched against the wind, boots heavy with mud, a bag slung across his back. At first, I thought it was one of the usual travelers moving west, the roadmen we had seen passing through before. But something about his pace, his careful attention to the landscape, and the way he held himself made him different, deliberate, cautious, and quietly commanding. My father spotted him first, squinting against the pale sunlight filtered through the lingering dust. "He's alone," he said, his voice low. "Not like the others. Be careful, Sam." By the time the stranger reached our village, the entire street seemed to hold its breath. Neighbors emerged from homes, some wary, some curious. Children pressed close to parents, peeking from behind shutters and corners, while the adults whispered quietly among themselves. In the depression, strangers were often both a blessing and a danger. They could bring news, help, or tools, but they could also carry misfortune, deceit, or hunger that the village could ill afford to feed. The stranger's eyes were sharp and gray, scanning the surroundings with a practiced wariness. His clothes were patched, dusty, and worn, but his movements were purposeful, steady. When he spoke, his voice carried a calm authority. "I'm looking for work, for news, for a place to rest. I've traveled far, and I've seen many towns, many farms. Some thrive, some fail, but I've learned what people need: tools, information, and sometimes a little hope." My father approached, hands relaxed but ready. "We're not strangers to hard times," he said cautiously. "If you stay, you'll work, and you'll earn your keep." The man nodded once, eyes flicking to the barn, the fields, and the clusters of people who now watched silently. "Fair enough. I can help with the harvest, repair fences, mend roofs. I can also tell stories about towns where work is starting, where the soil is better, where people have managed to rebuild after the worst dust and drought." Over the next few days, he proved his worth. His hands were skilled, able to fix a gate that had been barely holding together, patch a roof before rain could seep in, and even mend tools that had been abandoned in the fields. But it wasn't just his skill that drew people in, it was his stories. At night, after work was done, the villagers would gather around a small fire, and he would speak of distant towns, bustling cities, rivers flowing full and strong, and families who had survived storms that seemed impossible. His stories were detailed, grounded in observation, yet filled with hope, showing that life, while difficult, was never wholly defeated. He also carried small items: nails, screws, patches for clothing, and seeds. Nothing extravagant, nothing lavish, but enough to remind us that even a small gift could have weight far beyond its size. Children clustered around him, fascinated by his stories and the little treasures he shared, while adults listened carefully, exchanging glances of cautious optimism. Through his presence, I realized how fragile and interconnected survival was. One person could carry knowledge, skills, or hope that rippled through the community, helping us endure storms, dust, and scarcity in ways that simple labor alone could not. By the end of the week, the stranger had become more than just a visitor. He was part of our rhythms, helping with fields, offering guidance, and reminding us that the world beyond the village still moved, still offered possibilities, still held lessons worth listening to. Yet there was an air of mystery around him, a sense that his own story was long and difficult, shaped by lands far beyond our dusty fields, and that he carried unseen burdens beneath his calm demeanor. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the wind whisper through cracked windows, I thought about the ways people travel, not just along roads, but through lives, through hardships, through stories. And I realized that sometimes, the arrival of a single person could change the course of a village, or at least the way we imagined the world beyond our fences. The stranger on the road reminded us, quietly but insistently, that survival was never entirely solitary, that wisdom and hope could come from unexpected places, and that even in the heart of dust and despair, connections could be forged that strengthened the bonds of community. It came without fanfare, at first just a whisper of moisture in the air, a faint smell of wet earth that teased the senses after months of dust and dryness. The villagers paused, squinting at the sky, unsure whether to hope or to prepare for another false promise. Then, as afternoon stretched into evening, the clouds thickened dark and heavy, and the first drops fell, hesitant at first, then steadily, insistently, until the world seemed to drink in relief. The rain was miraculous and terrifying all at once. It soaked the brittle soil, darkened the cracked roads, and filled the river to a strong, persistent current. Crops that had struggled through frost and dust lifted their heads, leaves glistening with droplets, roots drinking deep. The air was fragrant with life renewed, sweet with the faint perfume of wet grass and mud, and the village seemed to hold its breath, watching the miracle unfold. My father was in the fields immediately, boots sinking into the softening earth, hands pressing into the soil to guide water toward the crops that had survived. "It's a gift," he said, voice rough with emotion, "but it's a fragile gift. We must work with it, care for it, protect it." My mother joined him, moving carefully through rows of corn and beans, adjusting leaves, clearing debris, murmuring encouragement to the young plants as if they could hear. Children ran through the rain, splashing in puddles, shrieking in delight, while neighbors trudged between fields, offering advice, helping wherever hands were needed. Even the stranger from the road smiled quietly, hands in the earth, eyes scanning the clouds and rain patterns, as if calculating the next steps. But rain also brought challenges. Paths became slick and treacherous, riverbanks threatened to overflow, and weak barns groaned under the sudden weight of water on roofs. The storm, though a blessing, demanded attention and care. One wrong step, one neglected channel, and the crops could drown, the soil could erode, and the fragile balance we had fought to maintain could unravel. We worked long hours, boots muddy, clothes drenched, hands raw. Together, the village improvised, trenches dug to redirect water, fences reinforced against flood, crops tied gently to prevent snapping. Every task required focus and cooperation, and every small success, a stalk upright, a seedling saved, a barn reinforced, felt like a triumph. By evening, the rain slowed, shifting to a gentle drizzle. The river sparkled under the fading light, reflecting the sky's muted pinks and grays. The fields, soaked and fragrant, were alive with potential. Even the dust, now washed from the roads and buildings, seemed grateful, settling in quiet corners instead of choking the air. That night, villagers gathered once more, not for a feast or a dance, but to share news of what the rain had accomplished, to recount the near misses and victories, and to plan for the work still required. The rain had given life, but it had also reminded us of the precariousness of our existence, how quickly blessing could turn to burden if ignored. I walked home slowly, boots leaving deep impressions in the softened earth. The air smelled sweet and alive, a scent I had not experienced for months, and I felt a renewed sense of wonder. Nature, harsh and unforgiving, could also nurture, could also heal, if we worked with it rather than against it. The stranger from the road lingered at the edge of the village, looking at the river, the fields, and the small homes that had survived storms, dust, and scarcity. He said nothing, but I sensed in his presence a quiet affirmation. Life, when tended with care, could endure even the most relentless hardships. Lying in bed that night, listening to the soft patter of lingering rain on the roof, I thought about cycles, of storms and sunshine, of dust and rain, of despair and hope. The world was not static, nor was survival a linear path. Each drop of rain, each gust of wind, each stretch of earth could change everything, reminding us that life demanded vigilance, humility, and courage. And for the first time in a long while, I felt a fragile certainty that no matter how harsh the world might become, with effort, unity, and care, the land, the village, and we ourselves could endure. It was on a cool, clear morning that the village gathered for a council. The rain had passed, leaving the earth damp and fragrant, the roads slick with mud, and the fields glistening with renewed life. The elders, the families who had stayed through storms, dust, and drought, and even the younger adults who had wandered west and returned, came together in the center of the village, near the old oak tree that had stood for generations, witnessing countless seasons, hardships, and quiet triumphs. I watched from the edge, curious, my boots sinking slightly in the softened soil. My father had been invited to speak, as had several other key members of the community. The stranger from the road, now a familiar figure, lingered nearby, quiet but attentive, his gray eyes scanning the group, observing the dynamics, offering counsel only when asked. The meeting began with reports. Families recounted the effects of the recent storm, the condition of their crops, livestock, and homes. Some had suffered losses. Barns had partially collapsed, fields had eroded, and gardens were damaged. Others had fared better, and the balance of needs and resources became clear. "Water must be shared wisely," said one elder, voice deep and firm. "We cannot allow one farm to take too much from the river, leaving neighbors in need. Every bucket counts. Every channel matters." The stranger added his observation, pointing to the riverbanks and irrigation channels. "The soil here is resilient," he said, "but it will fail if mismanaged. Crops may grow, but they must be guided, watered, and protected with care. You cannot rely on chance alone." Decisions were made collectively. Families agreed to share tools, seeds, and labor where needed. Those with stronger barns offered temporary shelter to neighbors whose structures had been damaged. Small groups were organized to monitor irrigation, repair fences, and redistribute resources. Every plan was debated, every voice considered, from the oldest elder to the youngest able-bodied helper. Children were included too, in small ways, helping carry water, tending minor tasks, learning the importance of cooperation and foresight. My sister, excited and determined, ran errands between groups, learning how even small hands could contribute to survival. I carried baskets of seeds, listening to the adults discuss planting rotations, soil preparation, and methods to protect against future storms or dust. The council was more than a meeting, it was a lifeline. It was a testament to the village's understanding that survival was not merely individual, but collective. Knowledge, experience, and labor were shared, and in doing so, strength multiplied. Arguments flared occasionally, voices rising, but always tempered by a mutual understanding. We are only as strong as our willingness to work together. I noticed how the stranger quietly guided discussions without dominating them. He asked questions that made people think, offered insights that connected past experiences to future needs, and reminded us all that patience, planning, and observation were as important as hard labor. He became a bridge between generations, a voice that encouraged both tradition and adaptation. By the time the council adjourned, the sun was high, scattering light over the damp fields and mud-streaked streets. Plans were clear, tasks assigned, and a sense of shared purpose filled the air. Even though uncertainty remained, the next storm, the next dust cloud, the fragile yields of crops, there was confidence that together, the village could endure what came. Walking home, I reflected on the quiet strength I had witnessed. The council was not about grandeur or authority. It was about connection, communication, and the collective will to survive. I realized that leadership wasn't always visible in loud voices or decisive gestures. Often, it was the patient listening, the careful observation, and the gentle guidance that mattered most. That evening, as my mother and father discussed irrigation schedules and my sister practiced carrying small loads of water, I understood something profound. Survival was not just about fighting the elements, harvesting crops, or enduring storms. It was about foresight, collaboration, and the courage to trust your neighbors. The recognition that every hand, every voice, and every decision mattered in the delicate balance between life and hardship. And so, as the village settled into the long afternoon, the work ahead both daunting and necessary, I felt a quiet pride. We were not just enduring the depression, the dust, and the storms. We were learning to live within it, to plan, to adapt, and to build something stronger than despair, a community that could face whatever the seasons and the world might throw at us. It began with a morning chill, the kind that nipped at fingers and toes even through thick wool. My father's call rang out across the yard, sharp and worried. One of the calves was missing. The small brown calf we had raised through the spring and early summer, a fragile promise of future milk and trade, was nowhere to be found. Panic rippled through the family first, then spread quickly to the neighbors, each realizing that even a single lost animal could mean weeks of hardship in a village already strained by storms and scarcity. We gathered immediately, boots crunching on frost-dusted paths, eyes scanning the fields and fences that had been reinforced after the last storm. My mother took my sister's hand, keeping her close while my father organized a search party, neighbors following with lanterns, ropes, and makeshift tools. The stranger from the road joined us, his calm presence a steadying force against rising anxiety. The search began systematically. We checked the fences first, looking for gaps or broken boards that the calf might have exploited. Then we followed the tracks in the mud, faint outlines that led toward the northern edge of the village, where the dust and rain had mingled to form sticky trails. Every few steps, someone would stop and peer at the ground, whispering theories or urging caution. Hours passed. The calf was clever, moving with a stubbornness that made tracking it difficult. At one point, I thought I saw a flash of brown among the tall weeds near the creek, only to find it was a piece of driftwood, tossed and twisted by the recent rain. The frustration weighed on everyone, but there was no giving up. Not now, not ever, not when the fragile lifelines of survival depended on persistence. As midday approached, we split into smaller groups, calling out its name in unison. My father and the stranger took one path along the riverbank, while neighbors searched the eastern pastures. I followed my mother, trudging through the damp grass and mud, eyes scanning every shadow, every rustle, every sign that the calf might have left behind. Finally, near the far edge of a field, we spotted it, trembling, mud-caked, but alive, trapped in a shallow ditch partially hidden by reeds and brush. Relief washed over the searchers like sunlight breaking through clouds. We worked carefully, pulling the calf free, brushing away the mud, and offering it water and comfort. Its small body shivered against us, but gradually it began to relax, trusting once again that it was safe. The return to the village was slow but triumphant. The calf followed cautiously, guided by my father and the stranger, surrounded by neighbors offering gentle encouragement. Children cheered quietly, adults smiled with a mixture of relief and renewed determination, and the sense of shared effort, of a problem met together, strengthened the bonds of our fragile community. By evening, the calf was back in its pen, straw replaced, water replenished, and a small meal of hay awaiting it. The family gathered, exhausted but grateful, reflecting on what had happened. It was a reminder that life remained unpredictable, that even small losses could feel monumental, and that survival depended on alertness, cooperation, and swift action. The stranger spoke quietly to my father, his tone matter-of-fact but insightful. The land gives, and the land takes. The storm took much, and this little one wandered, but your response made the difference. That is how communities endure, not by avoiding loss, but by meeting it together. I went to bed that night thinking about how close we had come to losing something so vital, and how the village had come together in response. Survival was more than planting crops, protecting the soil, or enduring storms. It was vigilance, adaptability, and unity, an understanding that every hand, every eye, every voice could matter in ways that might be invisible until the moment of crisis. The lost calf was more than an animal, it was a test, a reminder, a lesson. And as I drifted to sleep, I felt a quiet pride, knowing that we had passed it together, stronger for the effort, and ready for whatever challenge might come next.